All right, we are in Luke 7, 36 to 50. And this is the final week of our whirlwind tour of Jesus. So if you remember, we've been spending 5 weeks, 6 if you count last week's segue into Jesus and tragedy. 5 passages over 5 weeks that I think are so central to your understanding of Jesus. Without these under your belt, you might easily miss him completely. Okay? So if you've missed some of these passages, I would highly encourage that you listen to them on Slack. You know, we post them on Slack as they come up. I just think they're really, really valuable. Every single Christian ought to be like, not just familiar with the stories, but the way that the angle that you read these stories. Okay? And this final passage is so famous that it actually occurs in all 4 Gospels, which is fairly rare. Okay? So, all 4 of these passages, we're going to be in Luke 7. But if you're taking notes, you should write down the other passages are in Matthew 26, Mark 14, John 12. Or you can just search for Lazarus and you'll find him. Okay? In your Bibles. What'd you say?
John 12.
Yeah, it's Matthew 26, Mark 14, John 12. Okay. Now listen, all 4 of these stories, they tell the same basic story. Okay? You've got a woman with a reputation as a sinner. She breaks a jar of perfume. It's in a semi-public setting. She washes the feet of Jesus with her tears. She wipes it with her hair. She anoints him with the perfume or the ointment. Okay, that would have been a shocking cultural display. Remember, Judaism, every culture back then was still very patriarchal. Judaism was a conservative patriarchal culture where women were largely segregated from men. For instance, in the synagogues, we've dug up ancient synagogues, and they've actually found that there were women's sections. So the men didn't sit with the women. The women were in their own section, like back in the back or up in a balcony.
I think that's still the case.
Okay, in some it might be. The point is, imagine how scandalous it is, how shocking for something like this public display of affection from a woman to a Jewish rabbi in the middle of somebody's home, and everybody's just kind of sitting there watching it. Now listen, all of the passages establish that basic trajectory, but they all provide some different details. For instance, Matthew focuses on the disciples' reaction. What a waste. This money could have been sold and given to the poor. Mark tells us about the value of the flask. It was worth between, I think they say 300 denarii, which is somewhere, let's put it, ballpark, 50 to 60 grand. Okay? Extremely valuable. John says it was so potent that the fragrance filled the entire house. John also mentions that Judas was really the biggest complainer among the disciples because he kept the money bag and he used to help himself. Okay? And all the other 3 accounts actually place this right at the end of Jesus' ministry, literally 6 days before his crucifixion. And they actually say this is a trigger for Judas' betrayal. This is actually the point where Judas is like, that's it. I'm going to turn this guy in. I'm going to turn him over. Okay, that's what the other Gospels do. Now, Luke does something very different. He places it at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry, not because he thought it happened there, but because he wants to show you something about Jesus. And he actually focuses in on the interaction with the woman, but especially his interaction with the man, Simon. And I think Luke is saying there is something so central about Jesus in this passage, I'm going to put it right up front. So everything else you hear about Jesus, you are constantly thinking this in the back of your head because you read it first. Okay? I want you to read everything about Jesus through the light of this story. Okay, so are you intrigued? That's why we're looking at Luke 7. Here's our outline. 3 things. 1, there is a scene. And by that I mean something happens. Very dramatic. 2, there's a story. Jesus tells Simon a parable. 3, there's a point. What is Jesus trying to tell him? What is Jesus trying to tell us? Does that make sense? There's a scene, there's a story, there's a point. That's what we're going to look at today. Okay, let's jump right in. Let's talk about the scene. You kind of know the scene because we read it, but it's very easy to miss some of the things that go on. It's very dramatic, and in order to understand it, you actually need to understand the characters. In other words, think of this like a play. And if this were a play, there'd be kind of like 5 things on the piece of paper that are kind of like key figures or key developments. There's a boy, there's a girl, there's a sacrifice, there's a prophet, okay, and it's all happening on a stage. Boy, girl, sacrifice, prophet, stage. Those are all like 5 subpoints of my first point. So really this is like an 8-point sermon or something like that. But that makes sense? Setting the scene, there's 5 things you got to understand. Boy, girl, sacrifice, prophet, stage. So let's run through each of these. Okay, let's talk about the boy first. Who's the boy?
Jesus.
No, not Jesus. That was a great try. No. Jesus is going to be the prophet. Okay. We're talking about Simon the Pharisee. Okay. Now, how do you know his name's Simon?
Because he says it.
He says it. He says, Simon, let me ask you a question. Okay, it's right there in verse 40. How do you know that he's a Pharisee? It says that in verse 36, the very first verse. It says, one of the Pharisees asked him to eat with him, and he went into the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. Okay. People tend to be hard on Pharisees, and part of that's because Jesus himself was very hard on the Pharisees. But usually when Jesus was hard on the Pharisees, he was actually hard on them in general, as a group, kind of a voting block, if you want to call it that. Okay? In other words, he would paint with a broad brush and say, you guys are hypocrites. All right? In general. But one of the things that you see is if you actually read the Bible stories, there were plenty of Pharisees who, number one, appeared to be genuine. Okay, Jesus interacts with them. Do you remember Nicodemus? Okay, here's another one, Simon. Some of these guys went on to become Christians. So I want to be careful not to paint too broad of a brush where it's like, oh, all Pharisees are jerks. That's not the case. Okay, now all Pharisees probably did have a propensity in a certain direction. But the point here is there's no critique in this passage of Simon as a legalist, or Simon as a fake, or Simon as a hypocrite, or even Simon as self-righteous, really. Okay? The context, let's set this in, let me give you the best possible context for understanding Pharisees. Okay, the Old Testament is actually hard on the ancient Jews, the Israelites, for not taking God's word seriously enough. In other words, they're like, listen, you guys do the rites, you guys do the ceremonies, you're checking all the boxes, but your hearts are actually far from God. They're full of idols. You don't actually share God's heart. You don't love justice. You don't care about the poor. You don't actually practice this like deep integrity. Loving God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Loving your neighbor as yourself. You're doing the law on the surface, but it hasn't gotten down inside. Does that sound familiar? Okay. So in Jesus' day, the Pharisees were a group of people, and they're actually fairly ordinary Jews who said, you know what? We're going to try to actually take what the Bible says really seriously. And what that means is we need to try to do what it says. You should too. Okay? And so what they were doing, I think, good intention. What they were doing was almost like a revitalization effort to get everybody to stop just checking boxes and actually really try to do what the Bible says. So for the sake of our little drama, try seeing Simon through that lens. Does that make sense? He's a Pharisee, but I think he's a good-hearted Pharisee who is trying his best to follow God. Now, he's going to miss something. You're going to find that. But the point is, see him charitably. Don't just read him as a bad guy. Okay? That's Simon. He's the boy. Okay. Who's the girl? The woman. The sinner. Did you guys know her name is Mary? Now, you're like, Christian, it did not say Mary in this passage. You're right. But it does in the other accounts, okay, which is part of the reason why you read these other accounts. You're like, oh, it sheds light. Listen, her name is Mary. Get this. John tells us, the Gospel of John, that it's actually Mary, the sister of Lazarus. Did you know that?
Yeah.
Okay. Mary, the sister of Lazarus, in John chapter 12. What's John chapter 12 come after? John chapter 11. And what happens in John chapter 11? What? The resurrection. In other words, you actually have this famous story. You remember Mary and Martha and Lazarus dies, and both of them, like Jesus comes, and both of them are like, if you would have been here, my brother wouldn't have died. And Jesus weeps, and then he raises Lazarus. And what John tells us is not only is she the sister of Lazarus, but the feast was thrown in honor of Lazarus, and Lazarus is in the room, okay? And so is Mary, okay? So Lazarus is here in the room, which means this is not just some rando woman off the street who wanders in. They all know who she is, and she's got a reputation. What's so fascinating about this is most of us, when we read Mary and Martha and Lazarus, we think these two cute, sweet little girls. And when you read this, you actually go, wait a second, that's the same woman, and she actually has a reputation as a sinner.
So this is the same woman in Martha and Mary?
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying? Mm-hmm. Same Mary in
Yep.
Martha and Mary story.
Yep. Either that, or you have two guys named Simon who at two different times happen to have somebody named Mary who happened to break a jar of ointment worth 50 or 60 grand and anoint Jesus' feet.
This is Mary Magdalene, right?
We don't know that it's Mary Magdalene.
Oh, okay.
That's the other thing. Like, there's a lot of Marys
I know. I
in the
was like,
Bible. So sure, if you want it to be Mary Magdalene, go right ahead. Like, it doesn't hurt. But the point is, I think you can say with high confidence, this is Mary, the sister of Lazarus. Okay? And you can go read the other passages if you want to look more at this and see what you think for yourself. Here's my point. What is her reputation based on this story? She's a sinner. Okay? Most scholars think that's a polite Jewish way of saying that she's a prostitute. She's a whore. Or something very close to that. Some kind of public sexual indiscretion. Okay? Jesus does not say, by the way, that she's not that. He doesn't go, oh no, she's not. She's not a sinner. He actually accepts the definition and leans into it. Okay? So I'd like you to picture Mary, Martha's little sister from John 11, as a prostitute right after Lazarus has been raised, and she crashes the party where she's probably not in like good public favor, and she lets down her. So in other words, this isn't just a woman. This is somebody that everybody knows who has kind of gone, it's like a prodigal son, but a prodigal daughter. She's wayward. And she comes right into the middle of this thing. What happens is when they would have these meals, the people who are kind of at the center, they'd recline on the floor. They'd have little like stools or couches. Okay, and their food's in the middle, and their feet are all towards the outside. And they would sit around, and the kind of the important people would talk. But there's room around the outsides for everybody else. It's kind of a semi-public event for them to sit and listen. And she sneaks in, and she starts crying. And then she lets down her hair, and she starts doing this thing with Jesus' feet. And then she breaks the bottle of perfume, and all of a sudden, it's all anybody. You see what I'm saying? She's not at the center of the room, but guess what? She has become at the very center of everything that's going on right here. Okay.
And she's not like, in my head, like she's not under a table.
No.
Like
No.
behind.
Yeah, this would be like you could see their feet. Like there's nothing shady going on under a table somewhere. It's like that's the whole thing. It's very public. Like they're reclining, and this woman comes and like listen, it's crowded. I guarantee you the place was packed. And she like worms her way in and starts like crying, and then she's like heavy crying, and then she's like taking her hair down and she's like washing, like it would have been crazy. Scandalous. Okay. Now I want you to think about something for just a second, because we're talking about the girl. Boy Simon, girl Mary. How does the Old Testament look at prostitutes? Does anybody know? Oh, yeah. There you go. Oh, it's tough. Yeah. That's not the same kind of crying. That's like, I don't want to go to bed crying. Mary wasn't doing that. Listen, how does the Old Testament look at prostitutes? It's actually interesting. There's a lot of famous women in the Old Testament that were prostitutes. Okay. What'd you say? Yeah, Hosea's wife. You have, I'm not sure if she was Rahab. Yeah. There's a bunch. But here's what's interesting. The Old Testament never seems to explicitly ban or forbid prostitution carte blanche. In other words, listen, go search, and you'll be like, the closest you get is a reference to there shall not be any cult prostitutes. In other words, in the temple, it's like really specific. Temple worship does not have temple prostitutions, either male or female. Okay, but it doesn't, you actually don't get this carte blanche ban. Let me put it this way. Now, I'm not saying that means it's okay. All right? But the Old Testament spills way more ink on what you should eat or not eat, and how you like do all of the ceremonial ins and outs of the law and the temple and the tabernacle and all of there is pages and pages and pages and chapters. And almost no references explicitly, thou shalt not commit, prostitution. Now, having said that, the Old Testament definitely doesn't condone it or celebrate it. In general, I would say it strongly discourages it, and maybe a good way of saying it, the Old Testament's view is humans were meant for something better. Human beings are meant for a different kind of relationship than a prostitute, transactional sexual relationship. Let's just say it that way. That's kind of the Old Testament's view. More specifically, when the prophets are trying to point out Israel's sinfulness and Israel's waywardness, what is the image, their go-to image, their metaphor that they use for idolatrous Israel? It's prostitution. Basically what they're saying is, you Israelites have idols in your hearts. You've worshipped other gods the way clients worship prostitutes. You have a spiritual prostitution problem. So my point is not that the Old Testament thinks prostitution is fine, but it's interesting because it's not just this cart. But you would think that there would be pages and pages kind of drawing the boundaries on prostitution and making sure everybody was clear. Nobody's supposed to do this, and everybody that's a prostitute, they're bad people. And what you find is people look down, they know it's not right, but there's actually a surprising number of women who are prostitutes who somehow have an extraordinary role in the redemption story. So it's a nuanced view.
Sorry, wouldn't that be because, like, in reality, there wasn't many jobs for women to have if they needed to survive, but also the Old Testament is very clear, like, really, you're only supposed to have sex in marriage, and so
Yeah.
that they've already.
Good morning. Come on in. Carlene, it's good to see you. We got a chair somewhere over here or on the couch.
Oh, great. Thank you.
You bet.
And like, I think what it's modeling is that like, God is not mad at sex workers, if that makes sense. I think that's what he's kind of saying by not saying, he goes on about the sin of like what you're doing in your relationship if you go do that.
Yeah. So here's what I want you to see here. Remember, we're talking about Simon the Pharisee, who is trying to be everything the Old Testament wants him to be. Now here you have this woman, and the Old Testament is like, it's got kind of it's a nuanced view, but it's not like prostitutes are dirty or bad. It's like there's something better. But she is literally, think about this, Mary is literally everything Simon is trying not to be spiritually. She's a prostitute. And so you would think, given the Old Testament stance, you've got a guy who is trying hard to be everything the Old Testament wants him to be, and you've got a woman who is struggling for the Old Testament ideal of marriage. Who do you think Jesus would side with? And the answer is really, really surprising. Okay? That's what I want you to see right now. Everybody in the room would have thought, oh, Jesus is going to side with the Pharisee. Okay? And instead, Jesus actually really affirms, okay, the woman. So let's talk about sacrifice. Here's the so you've got the boy, Simon the Pharisee. You've got the girl, Mary the harlot, the prostitute. Lazarus' sister. Now let's talk about sacrifice. And this is an interesting choice of a word. It's intentional. Most of you guys, when you hear the Bible talk about sacrifice, you probably think about animal sacrifice, which is in the Old Testament, like sacrifice for sins. Okay. But the Old Testament also had categories for sacrifices that didn't involve killing something. For instance, there were free will offerings. There were thank offerings. There was something, which I'm not fully sure what it is, called a wave offering. There were sacrifices of praise. And the idea was, you take something valuable. You're not trying to atone for sins. But you're taking something valuable and you're trying to show God how much you appreciate Him. So you take this really valuable thing and you give it to Him freely for Him to use, which would have looked like His priests in the temple making use of it. There's an example. Do you guys remember the story of a woman named Hannah? It's right at the beginning of 1 Samuel. She can't get pregnant. And she goes to the temple and she's praying, and the priest in the temple thinks she's drunk, and she's like, no, I'm actually asking for a son. And she says, Lord, if you will give me a son, I will give him back to you. Okay? And that son, she gets pregnant, and that son is Samuel, and he grows up in the temple. Okay? Now listen, that would be an example of, there's a sacrifice of praise where she gave her most valuable possession, her son. Okay, now listen. What would Mary be grateful for here? It's pretty obvious.
Redemption.
What?
Redemption or acceptance.
What just happened in John chapter 11?
Her brother.
Her brother got raised from the dead. Okay, if you had somebody that was dead,
Especially because I'm sure her brother was the one who took care of her.
and you actually, probably, and you actually cared for him, even though you were kind of an outcast in the family, you knew he probably cared for you, and Jesus comes and raises your brother from the dead after many days. Okay, the text says he starts to stink. Okay, 4 days. And now listen, you would probably be overwhelmed with gratitude. It's fascinating that Martha's not here, also doing so. But Mary's here. She's over. And what I'm trying to get at is, what's really interesting is if you look at what Mary is doing in this passage, when she lets down her hair and she starts weeping, it's really interesting to read that as a sacrifice of praise. Okay? Now, you can read it differently if you want. But here's what's interesting. What does she have to offer that's valuable? Okay? Perfume, ointment. That's the most valuable thing she has. For years, I thought, wrongly, oh, that must mean she's good at her job. She can afford nice things. Okay. It's actually not that. Because what this is, okay, when you think of that, when you read it as perfume, how do you get, you guys, some of you guys who do perfume, some of you do perfume, I'm assuming. I don't do perfume. But it's like, what you do is you buy a bottle, it's really expensive, and you just go, tss, tss, and you do a little squirt, right? That's not like this. In other words, it's not like she can do a little dab of this whenever she wants to. This comes it's an alabaster flask, which has been ceramically sealed. And from one of the other accounts, we know that it's about 16 fluid ounces. Okay, something like that, 12 to 16. So it's a fairly small amount. They probably would have reduced. It's made out of pure nard. It's the reason they say ointment. It's probably not like perfume's actually diluted, so you can use it. Okay, this is non-diluted. So imagine the essence of perfume. I don't know how much it would dilute down, but imagine all of that and take it times 16 ounces. That would be a massive amount of very, very special perfume. Some scholars think, like, how on earth did a woman get this? It was probably a family heirloom.
What was the original purpose of it?
So it would have been something that very, very wealthy people had.
Right.
Like maybe royalty, like that caliber. And it would have been like, for a very special occasion, you could, like, let's say you had a big celebration.
Yeah.
That thing was enough potency that you could make a gathering for thousands of people probably smell great.
Okay.
Like, so I'm saying, so it would be like super, super primo stuff, and somehow she's got it. But the perfume, when it's in this alabaster flask, is kind of like champagne. Like, you don't just crack a champagne. Champagne's not like scotch where you can take a little bit, sip on it, work on it. Once you open a bottle of champagne, you better be ready to drink the whole thing. It's done. When she cracks open this flask, the whole thing's getting used right then and there. And they're not in a like Coliseum or some big outdoor space. They're in a small house that's probably not much bigger than this, maybe a little bit. And it says the fragrance fills the entire room. So listen, what if you think about what she does, breaking that vase, washing Jesus' feet with her tears, with the ointment, drying it with her hair. What if you think about that as an Old Testament sacrifice to God of praise? And you should ask yourself, what's God going to think about this? After all, she's not pure. She's a prostitute. Do you see the irony? It's like, is God going to be happy with this sinful woman offering this sacrifice of praise? Okay. Are you starting to see how the tension sits? So you've got a man, you've got a woman, a boy and a girl. You've got this sacrifice thing, which is the perfume. And then you've got a prophet. And listen, the prophet's really simple. Who's the prophet? Jesus. In other words, Simon, the Pharisee, thinks in his head, if this man was a prophet, he would know what kind of woman this is doing this. You see, he's answering the question of how he thinks God would respond. He thinks God would be disgusted. He thinks God would be offended. And he is amazed that Jesus is not just like, how dare you? And he thinks, he must not know who she is. Okay? And he thinks it in his head. If he were a prophet, surely. And what does Jesus do? Reads his freaking mind. He's like, oh, Simon. And Simon's like, I didn't say anything. Okay? I was just thinking it. All right. The point is, Jesus does something only a prophet can do. He reads the heart and mind, and now he's going to speak to it. So you've got a boy, a girl. You've got this lavish sacrifice of something really, really valuable, okay, by somebody who most people actually wouldn't treat as valuable. And then you've got this prophet who can read minds. And last of all, this is all happening on a stage. And by stage, I mean it's happening in a room, maybe not much larger than this. Simon is evidently wealthy. He throws a party. Bethany is a small town. It's common for these types of things to be semi-public events where ordinary people can listen around the edges. So there is an audience watching all this. This is going to be the talk of the town for weeks to come. Okay. Now there's 2 more details I want to point out. Are you guys finding this interesting? Okay, there's 2 more details. Number 1, did you know that Matthew says Simon's got a longer name? It's Simon the leper. Isn't that interesting? Okay. Now, that's not a common nickname. They didn't walk around and be like, yo, now a leper. In other words, being a leper, that's not a good nickname. Okay. So if you say, why did they call Simon the leper? Can anybody have any ideas? He probably used to be a leper. Okay. Now, listen, think. That probably also means that Jesus cured him. Because if a leper throws a party, nobody's going.
Yeah.
All right? So unless, in other words, Simon the leper is probably what he was called, and it is very, very, very plausible, I think, that Jesus had healed Simon from his leprosy.
Well, it's also like notable that he would have been an outcast. Like
Yes. Okay. He would have been. We're going to get there in just. So I think he was a Pharisee before he became a leper. I think he's been a Pharisee the whole time. Okay. But I think Simon was a leper. Jesus cured him. Now, secondly, this is the part I want you to just observe. There is a deep irony in this scene.
God was expecting him to do.
Have any of you guys ever known a prostitute or talked to one?
Yeah.
I've had 2 interactions with a prostitute, and one of them was very instructive for me. She was very brazen about. She was like there was an article in the paper in Missoula how she's starting her own religion, and I'm like, yeah, whatever. And so, but I reached out to her. I'm like, oh, you're starting a religion? I'm a pastor. I'd love to know. Anyway, so she's like telling me all about it, and how like this is like she's kind of describing everything she does and how this is her religion and men can get forgiven by coming to her. And I'm like, and I asked a question. In other words, she was completely brazen about what she did. And then I asked her a question about how she felt internally. And it was almost like I had slapped her. And all of a sudden, she shut down. She got really distant. And it was basically like, don't you dare ask me that. And what I realized was she was actually really, really emotionally guarded. And I don't know this, I'm not an expert in prostitutes. But I have heard that if you're a prostitute, you almost need to be emotionally distant because of the nature of your work. You are doing this transactional thing. You can't get emotionally invested with every single person you're sleeping with. It would destroy you. So here she is, under the lights, in the public, center of attention, and she's actually, instead of being emotionally distant and unavailable, she is actually incredibly emotional. She is uncontrollable in her weeping. She is washing her feet with her tears. She's kissing him. She's anointing him. And so you've got a professional sinner, her vocation. She should be stoic, and yet she's deeply moved by Jesus. Simultaneously, you've got I'm going to call him a professional saint. I mean, Simon. He had made his religion almost like his vocation. He ought to be deeply engaged, deeply emotionally attuned to Jesus. And what you see is the woman who shouldn't be emotionally available is. And the guy who ought to be emotionally available isn't. Okay, and I don't think it's because he's a bad person. I think he's distracted. It's actually a lot like the story of Mary and Martha, where Mary's busy with serving, Martha's busy with serving, and Mary just wants to sit at Jesus' feet. Were you going to ask a question?
It's almost like if Jesus cured him, was he more worthy of the cure than her?
Okay, hold that. This is so good. Do you see how as you start to put these details together, it starts leading us in a direction? Okay. all he can think about, maybe it's Jesus' reputation, but maybe more so, he has an attitude towards Mary on the basis of her behavior and her reputation. Now listen, that's what's going on. So Jesus tells a story, and I'm going to do this part very quickly. Look at verse 41 and 42. Well, it starts in 40. I love this. Jesus is like, Simon, great dinner. I have something I'd like to say to you. So Simon says publicly, say it, teacher. And Jesus goes, I've been thinking about this little parable. I'd like to know what you think of it. And he says, a certain moneylender had 2 debtors. One owed 500 denarii. We're talking denarii again. 500, that's a lot. Let's call that 100 grand. The other had 50. Let's call that 10 grand. Now, when they could not pay, neither of them, he canceled the debt of both. Now, which of them will love him more? And Simon answered, the one, I suppose, for whom he canceled the larger debt. And he's like, well done, Simon. You have judged rightly. And then he's going to elaborate. Now, listen, here's what's going on. A couple of things to point out. First of all, I mentioned this already, but Simon calls her a sinner, and Jesus doesn't disagree. He doesn't say, no, she's not a sinner. That's fine. You're too uptight. You're taking the Bible too seriously. He doesn't say that. But the way that Simon uses that word probably would have meant something like this. When he says sinner, he means somebody whose behavior demonstrates their distance from God. In other words, her bad behavior demonstrates she's not very close to God. And what's ironic, you ready for this one? The Old Testament never talks about people using that language of sinner. Go search the Old Testament. You're going to find like one reference to the word sinner. And you're like, that's really odd. How does the Old Testament talks about sin. The Old Testament talks about atonement. Okay, but it primarily uses the language not of sinners, but of clean and unclean. All right. Unclean people need to keep their distance from God lest his holiness break out against them. So someone who is a prostitute probably would not have been welcome in the temple, but neither is somebody who is crippled or somebody who is blind or somebody who had leprosy. So here's what's ironic. By the Old Testament definition, Simon, as a leper, would have been just as distant from God as this woman. Now listen.
Unless he'd been cleansed.
What'd you say?
Unless he'd been healed and cleansed.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is his fundamental position, Simon's looking at this woman going, I am not like her. And Jesus turns the story around and he says, let me tell you a story. He starts using debt language, and they're both debtors. In other words, Jesus is looking at both of them, and he's seeing both of them as more equal than they are different. You see that?
Is he saying that is Jesus saying that Simon should love just as much, if not more, as this woman, because he should view himself as the one who owed 500 denarii instead of 50?
I think Jesus is saying, well, first of all,
or really that he should have more empathy for this woman.
He is saying, he's going to say, Simon should love more, period. Because listen, Simon, if he's been cleansed of leprosy versus this woman who had her brother raised, both of those ought to go, oh my goodness, God is in our midst and he has had mercy on me. And what you find is this woman is so undone by what Jesus has done for her that she is moved. And Simon is just focused on the party and who's here and how this woman is like wrecking everything because she's causing a scene. He's not moved by gratitude at what Jesus has done. Okay.
I also think it's interesting too, right? Like you're saying, if you were dirty, right, you were supposed to keep your distance, and yet Jesus is calling the dirtiest closer.
Yeah.
Or like he turns their entire cultural view upside down. Therefore, like rejecting their cultural practices of like.
Do you see how everything's playing in this? When you start to and so what I'm really trying to do is set you up for the structure so you can meditate on this passage. Okay? Now listen, Jesus doesn't make sinner his metric. Instead, he chooses the word debtor. Isn't that an interesting shift? He implies that both Simon and Mary owe something to God. Now, the size varies.
Technically, we all owe something.
Yes. Now, listen, let me ask this question. How many of us actually look at every human being and look at ourselves and go, I owe God something? Most of us don't do that. Most of us think, I've got some stuff to offer God, and I'm better than Noah, or I'm better than, fill in the blank. And we look at other people and we think, I've got more to offer than those other people. And Jesus is actually saying, here's the metaphor, okay, and this is going to seem a little dangerous, because if you think that you owe something to God, you're going to be like, oh, now I've got to earn it. But what he's getting at is, no, you owe something to God, okay, that you can't actually pay. That's the key. Jesus seems to be saying that starting to see yourself as deeply in debt to God is a critical lens for how you look at things and then he comes back to the woman, and he definitely says, he doesn't say that she's not a sinner or a debtor. Instead, he says she's forgiven. And he's the one who decides. And the question is, why is she forgiven? And the answer is because she loved much. Okay, so here's your setup. You've got this scene, and he tells a story, and what's the point? The point is, you're supposed to love much. Do you see that? Now listen, it's not just love in general. Who are you supposed to love much? Not just God. Who?
Your neighbor.
Not just your neighbor, not yourself. Jesus! She has massive love pouring out in the direction of Jesus. And Jesus, in other words, this is pointy love. It's aimed. Jesus is not talking about just blanket love for puppies and things like that. Okay? Or yourself. He's actually saying, you need to love God and you need to love others. But really, in this passage, he's going, you need to love me. Okay? Now listen. He uses the language of love much versus love little. And basically what he's saying is, if you love much, even the greatest sins can be forgiven. But if you love little, you are going to experience little forgiveness. The point here is that Jesus wants you to love him so much that it moves you. Okay? In other words, this isn't just like an emotional love. This isn't just intellectual love. It actually moves you to sacrifice the things that are most valuable, most dear, most precious to you, and it might include your reputation. Now, her reputation is already in tatters, but it didn't get better. Okay? This is what faith is. Look at the very last. Your faith, listen, her whole point, Jesus' whole point, she loved much, so she is forgiven much, and then he turns to her and he says, your faith has saved you. In other words, you want to know what faith is in Jesus' definition? Loving him much. Loving him so much that it actually moves you into a willingness to sacrifice for him. Okay. 2 questions. How are you doing? How many of us look in the mirror and go like, man, do I love Jesus? I love, like, most of us, if we read this, we should all be like, I actually don't love Jesus that way. Okay? Does your faith, your love for Jesus, move you? Second question should be, well, how do I do that? Okay? That's actually the most important. And I think what's really interesting is Jesus seems to say that you need to recognize the size of the debt that has been forgiven. In other words, the whole reason that you see yourself as a debtor, it's not to like make you now earn it, because you can't. But the more you see yourself as a debtor, the more you actually start to go, oh my goodness, my debt's been cleared. I've been freed. I've been redeemed. Okay? There's a guy named Jack Miller who died a while back, but he was a pastor. But he was famous for saying this thing. He'd say, cheer up. You're worse than you thought. And then he'd continue, but you are more loved than you would ever dare to dream. And what Jesus is getting at is these two things go together. Listen, if all you did, Jesus is looking at Simon and he's going, dude, you are worse than you thought. You're just as bad as this woman. You are no better. But if all you did was say, cheer up, you're worse than you thought, Mary Beth. Okay, do you know how that would feel? Withering. That's what religion does. You're worse than you thought. Okay, now there's a flip side. It's like, oh, you're fine. Everything's love, 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 love. Okay? And what that actually does is give you kind of a false sense of security. But when you take these two things together and to say you are worse than you thought, but you are more loved than you ever imagined, and you go, how can that be? And the answer is somebody sacrificed to pay your debt. And fundamentally, that is the heart of Christianity, is recognizing I am a debtor that cannot pay. I am every bit as bad as the worst person I can think of and imagine. And if Jesus would have mercy on me, oh my goodness, I should have mercy and compassion and just empathy for everybody around me. See what I'm saying? Let me just read a couple other thoughts. We're going to stop here. It's really interesting. For Jesus, the primary problem does not seem to be sin. And he's not saying that sin's not a problem, but it's more like Jesus looks at sin and goes, oh, I can deal with that. It's going to cost me my life. But the real problem is the problem of our hearts. Our hearts don't love God, neighbor, and especially Jesus the way we ought to. That's your problem. It's your lack of love. Do you see how foundational this is to Christianity? If you come to Christianity and you don't understand this, you're going to either get a really big view of sin or a really big view of like grace and compassion, but not the two of those things together. Okay? The real issue is that all of us need to have a radically more love. We need to be great lovers, not in general, but of Jesus in particular. Okay? Jesus has just raised Mary's brother from the dead. And the fact that he just raised that, I don't know if you remember the story. When it happened, the religious leaders, many of whom were Pharisees, were like, that's it, we got to stop this. We're not just going to kill Jesus, we're going to kill Lazarus too. Okay? In other words, Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead is going to result in his own death. But he was glad to die. That's how much he loved Mary. In other words, what Mary saw, the text in John actually says, Jesus loved Lazarus and Martha and Mary. And I actually think Jesus loves Simon. Jesus is not here trying to kick Simon in the nuts. He is here trying to wake Simon up. In other words, Jesus' love is for everybody. What he wants is Simon doesn't yet understand how much Jesus loves him and how costly it is. Like, Jesus makes Simon clean, but he's going to be treated like he's unclean, cast out by the Jewish people and the Gentiles. Okay? Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, but it's going to cost him his life. Mary is the person who sees this. Okay? He loved Martha, he loved her sister, he loved Lazarus. Jesus would never ask us to do something that he doesn't willingly do himself, or he's not willing to do. So when he says, I want you to love greatly, he can say that because he loves greatly. And that is the most important thing. You've got to get to know the love of Jesus. That's what it really means to be a Christian. And what will happen is when that happens, your behavior will start to change. But it's not like, oh, here's what I got to do to clean myself up. It's like, oh my goodness, here's how God's love is shaping me and remaking me. It's a response. Okay. We're going to talk about some of this over lunch. Let's pray, and we'll come to the Lord's Supper.